Thank you so much, Trevor. Appreciate that. I again want to welcome all of you for being here, and I want to introduce the one that's going to share God's word and God's heart with us and share some wonderful things with us. And the first insert that we had about this weekend is one that had this in it, and we kind of tweaked it on later ones, but I just want to share with you some things that you may not know about Dr. Lynelle Ellis. She's an associate professor in the communication department at Walla Walla University. Yes, okay. And the director of the Center for Media. She worked for 13 years in media ministry at Blue Mountain Television in College Place. Do anybody recall her with that? I remember how she was leading that out so wonderfully. And was also a professor at Southern Adventist University, where she taught communication and media courses. I'm thinking in my mind, very busy and wide experience. Her postgraduate studies included work in the areas of media literacy, media effects, and media ecology. And her doctoral dissertation studied the historical and contemporary conflict between Christianity and visual media. And she is married to Daniel Ellis, who's with us today. Welcome to you as well, Daniel. And they have 3 children: Garrett, age 19, Lauren, age 17, and Ashton, age 17. And I really hadn't read that through thoroughly. I mean, I unfortunately do that sometimes. So I was visiting with Lynelle and Daniel out in the foyer when they arrived, and it dawned on me that they have twins too. We have twins, they have twins, and so it's just fun to compare notes about raising twins and seeing what they're like. But I believe that the highest recommendation to you for listening to her today is that she loves Jesus with all her heart, and she is committed to him. And so, Dr. Lynelle, thank you so much for being here and sharing with us. Let's give her a warm welcome from the Valley Adventist Church.
Good morning. I am very happy to be here today and to share with you some things that are important to me, have been important to me, and I'm sure will continue to be important to all of us as we live in a very mediated society. We've titled this Media Choices. That's the seminar that is beginning right now with this first session this morning, and then we will be continuing this afternoon at 2 o'clock with a couple more sessions related to this topic. So I hope that you'll be able to stay by for what promises to be a fantastic fellowship meal and then more this afternoon. Let's start with the thing that we need to look at first, and that is the power of media. And so that is the title of this morning's presentation. We have to understand what it is we're really dealing with. And we might be saying to ourselves, yes, but I live with media all the time. It is everywhere. It's in my car. It's in my house. It's at my work. It's in my pocket or purse or hand. Everywhere that we go. So maybe we feel like we understand it, but it's good to take a little bit of a step back and try to understand how media works and what the power of it is. I'd like us to look at a word that may be a new word for some of you. I know when I first began getting into studying this topic, I was looking for a synonym for the word discernment. And I came across this word, and it was new to me at the time: perspicacity. I even had to look up, how do you say it? Perspicacity. What is perspicacity? Well, it is a Latin word, and it is the word for penetrating sight. If you have perspicacity, you are good at discerning what is really going on. And wouldn't we all like to have that kind of penetrating sight? The kind that we hear about in Psalms when David says, "Your law, your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path." That kind of light, that kind of penetrating sight that helps us to have some wisdom and know what is really going on. So as we spend some time together today, I hope that this word, perspicacity, will be a foundational theme for us, that we are looking for some penetrating sight, some discernment about what is really going on. And for a little inspiration, Psalm 119:66 uses that word discernment, a synonym for perspicacity. Teach me good discernment and knowledge, for I believe in your commandments. And we're those people. We're those people who believe in the commandments. That's why we're all gathered here this morning. We are the people who put importance, we have value, we care about what God has to say about how we should live. And so we ask Him, we plead with Him along with the psalm here. Teach me good discernment and knowledge. So what am I talking about when I talk about visual media? I thought maybe we should have a little base to work from. I'm talking about movies, shows, videos, games, social media. And where do we find these things? We find them on devices like televisions, tablets, smartphones, gaming consoles, and computers. So that's kind of, and there's somebody's smartphone right now. And hopefully not mine. No, mine's still sitting over there. Okay, so as we talk about our media use and what we do with the media, and both this content types that we're talking about and the devices on which we consume those content types, I'm really looking at two things in this equation: time and content. And I think these are both concerning issues for us as we are consumers, users of media. The first one is, how much time are we spending on our devices, on our screens, if you want to put it that way? How much time is being given to that? And then second, what about the content? So that's part of the equation too. We can be spending too much time, or we could be spending, well, it could be both, I guess, too much time with the wrong kind of content. It could even be too much time with good content. That's possible. And so both of those things are something we want to look at. Now we're just going to take a few moments to look at some statistics about kind of where we are with this when we look at the nation. And these are some of the most recent studies that we have access to at this point. The first one we're going to look at is kids ages 0 to 8. Okay? 0 to 8. This is from Common Sense Media, and the last time they did their study was 2020. And I wish it was a little newer, because we all know 2020 was a pretty unique year. Okay. It was. If we were not all on our screens more in 2020, I don't know. And 2021 too, for that matter. Maybe we're returning to a little bit of normal, but I must say we all got really more used to our screens even than we were before during the pandemic. But this study from Common Sense Media says that kids ages 0 to 8 are on their screens a lot, as you can see. Young children, those who are, just up to 2 years old, 49 minutes a day, that's nearly an hour. And then we have also the 2 to 4-year-olds at 2.5 hours a day, and then on up from there to 8-year-olds, over 3 hours a day on screens. And we could go really deep with this. We don't have time to, but if you look at some of the studies done by those who are experts with early childhood development, they'll tell you that the less screen time, the better, and especially under age 2, if it could be 0. It would really, really be good. I feel a little guilty right now because I know there was some screen time for my kids when they were between 0 and 2. It's pretty tempting to put on some really nice music videos of happy little Christian songs for them to watch in the afternoon when you just need a break for a second. Please, could I have 5 minutes peace? Just 5, maybe even 15. So was there some of that going on? There was. But ideally, that it would be that we would keep really little kids, especially, off screens at all, because it changes the way their brains work. Their attention spans, their ability to focus, to concentrate, the way the brain is actually formed. And that's pretty important. I think we all want our children to have their brains formed properly. And so we should be concerned about that. Use of screen media is up. That's not surprising, okay? This is a 2021 study now. 2021 study, use of screen media is up 20% for tweens and teens. Now we're looking at that next age bracket as we go up. And we can see that they're spending now, teens, 13 to 18 years old. Let me go to the next slide, actually. Let's move on to tweens and teens here. The teens are spending over 8.5 hours a day on their screens. That is a lot of time. So right now I'm just telling you what we kind of already know. I mean, maybe these statistics are sort of shocking to us when we look at them in bar graphs and that sort of thing on the screen. But we kind of know this is the case if we look around at ourselves and at our families. We know we're on the screen a lot. And what about adults? Because we certainly do not get home free on any of this, those of us who are adults. This is really just broken down by how we use the media and how many hours a day we're on various media. You can see there mobile media is the largest at over 4 hours a day on mobile media. So that would be primarily your smartphone, maybe a tablet, something like that that goes around with you wherever you go. And you can see the other things broken down there. All of this just to say that we know we're using media a lot. If we didn't recognize it, we can see the numbers there. And now I'm going to do something that goes against all the rules I ever teach when I'm teaching a speech class. I'm going to read to you from the screen a lengthy article, not super, super long. But yeah, when we teach speech, we always say, keep everything on the screen really brief, and because the audience can read faster than you can, and you probably can, but I'll try to read it to you engagingly anyway. But I really want you to be able to absorb what this article from 2018, so this is pre-pandemic, but the things that this article says are essential for what we need to know, and I can't say it better than this article, so let's do it. Though concerns often seem to focus more on children, a recent report from the Pew Research Center suggests that parents are just as compromised by screens as their kids. Well, you would be hard-pressed to find a job that didn't include at least some activity on a computer. Too much time in front of screens each day can cause side effects, such as headaches or migraines, sensitivity to light, sore neck, and dry eyes caused by blinking 60% less. I was kind of testing that out the other day. I think it's true. According to Psychology Today, another one of the fundamental consequences that a large amount of screen time has on adults is a restructuring of the matter that makes up your brain, specifically atrophy in the gray area where processing occurs, and compromised white matter translate into the loss of communication within various areas of the brain, such as the cognitive and emotional brain centers. According to addiction expert Dr. Nicholas Kaderis, for adults who aren't full-on addicted, he recommends tech-free dinners, no tech periods throughout the day, and keeping your phone away from your nightstand. You can also increase your non-screen activities like your other activities like sports, recreation, and face-to-face time with loved ones. And now for children, this is more of the same article. For kids these days, most of whom have grown up alongside the rise of the digital age, drawing the line between addiction and normal activities can be almost impossible. In other words, how do we know when it's really addiction or when it's just the way we all live? Almost impossible, especially with screen-based technologies becoming ubiquitous in schools. I know my daughter, first few years at high school, they were required to have the iPad that was checked out to them. She doesn't have an iPad at home, but she had one the whole day at school. And now they've moved to Chromebooks, which is a little easier to use actually for students and more academically oriented, but still required there. Combine that with social media, mobile devices, and gaming, and it makes sense why a recent survey found that children spend an average of 1,314 hours in front of screens each year. So with all these activities seeming fairly standard, it's easy to wonder, what's the harm? Unfortunately, the answer is children's bodies and brains. According to the American Optometric Association, children are increasingly learning how to use technology before they can talk, walk, or read, risking serious consequences to the development of young eyes. Additionally, research has found that screen time is also directly linked to poorer connectivity in areas associated with language and cognitive control. So these are some of those things that I was alluding to a few moments ago. As for the brain, recent brain imaging research shows screen technologies and cocaine affect the brain's frontal cortex in the same way. These effects are especially true with the side effects of gaming. Research on video games shows dopamine, present in reward processing and addiction, is released during gaming, and that craving or urges for gaming produces brain changes that are similar to drug cravings. With games like Fortnite and Minecraft steadily engaging children and young adults, it seems as if there are even more opportunities for addiction. In fact, in June of this year, the World Health Organization recognized gaming addiction as more than just a health risk, but as a mental health disorder. That's really kind of an astounding thing to have had happen, actually. Many, many, many years prior to 2018, where research was being done in this area, competing research, much of it funded by gaming companies, and then other research funded by academics, never coming to the same conclusion, can you imagine? Until finally, some decisions were made. Unfortunately, screen addiction has even more consequences. Dr. Nicholas Kaderis, author of Glow Kids, How Screen Addiction is Hijacking Our Kids, claims, quote, "I've worked with hundreds of heroin addicts and crystal meth addicts, and what I can say is that it's easier to treat a heroin addict than a true screen addict." Although he says the evidence is clear, he also suggests we're just not ready to face the facts. Quote, "We have a society gone all in on tech. So we don't want some buzz-killing truth-sayers telling us that the emperor has no clothes and that the devices that we've all so fallen in love with can be a problem, especially for kids and developing brains," he adds. All right. That was a lot to soak in. But it lets us know this is something worth thinking about. Despite the number of hours that parents, okay, this is parents now, spend on their digital devices, 78% of us believe that we are good technology role models. Yes, we are, for our children. But in reality, all that time that parents spend behind screens is likely to set, you can guess it, a bad example for our children. Whoops, don't look at that. That wasn't supposed to come on yet. Okay, let me tell you a little story. I like movies. It happened one night. It's a really old movie. Frank Capra, that's the same guy that made It's a Wonderful Life, in case you're wondering about him. He got teased in his day for making movies that were just too warm and fuzzy, too happy, too good. But Frank Capra made a film called It Happened One Night, starring Clark Gable and Claudette Colbert, 1934. Now, 1934, when people would go to the theater in 1934, how special was that experience for them? Very special. Nobody had a television at home. Nobody had a computer. Nobody had a smartphone. If you were going to see some moving pictures, you went to the actual building. It was a very, very special event. And pictures didn't move that often. All right, so they went to see, if you went to see It Happened One Night, something interesting happened in this story. In the story, in case you're not familiar with the film, a news reporter, that's played by Clark Gable, and a very rich woman who's running away from home meet up on a bus. He recognizes who she is. She doesn't know he recognizes who she is. And they strike up sort of a friendship. They don't like each other at first, but it's one of those, opposites attract and they're destined to become a couple kind of stories. Well, as it happens, the bus breaks down in a very, very small town, and the only place to stay is this little roadside motel. And in 1934, you never stayed in a hotel with someone you weren't married to. You had to prove you were. So Clark Gable says they're married and gets them the last room in the little hotel so they have somewhere to stay. But he's a decent guy. So he strings up between the two beds in the hotel sheets and blankets on a rope so that they're like it's in two separate rooms and everything's going to be as it should. And it is, because this is a 1934 movie. The production code is in effect. Okay, have you ever read the production code from the 1930s? It sounds a lot like a church manual. Really. It does. It's amazing. So they're on opposite sides of the sheet. He goes over to his side to get into his pajamas to go to bed, and the camera follows him to his side where Clark Gable takes off his shirt. And you know what? He is not wearing an undershirt. Clark Gable removes his shirt, and it's just his skin under there. What? In 1934, every man, probably in the world, but definitely in America, got up every morning and put on his underwear, bottom and top, because the shirt was part of the underwear. Every man. And in the South, they still are. Right? Yes. When we lived in the South, my husband quickly realized that he's a therapist, so therapist, like as in physical and occupational therapy. So the therapist garb, right, is like some khaki pants and a polo shirt. Well, when he got to the South, he realized that if he was going to be dressed for work, he had to have the undershirt visibly showing under the polo shirt. Yes. So still the case there for sure. However, in 1934, every man was doing this. Well, Clark Gable didn't have an undershirt. Guess what happened to undershirt sales in this country due to this film? 75% drop nationwide in the sale of undershirts. If Clark Gable doesn't have to wear an undershirt, I don't either, said the men of America. So I tell you this because there is power in visual media. Now, would this have the same effect today? Not in the same way due to the fact that we have so much media consumed that not everybody is going to see the same thing, with a few exceptions. But back then, it had a huge audience that was receiving the same information. This one's not funny, like the last story is just fun. This is not fun. In The Deer Hunter, there is a scene where there's a game of Russian roulette. You know what that is, where you load the gun and one of the cartridge, what do I call that thing? Cartridge has a bullet in it and the rest don't, and you don't know if you're going to actually die or not, but you give it a try. So by 1986, there were 43 documented Russian roulette deaths that were directly attributed to imitations of this scene in the 1978 film. That's painful. Any book that you're going to find, any textbook or something talking about media effects is going to reference this case, this story. This is the dark side of imitation of what we see, of modeling of what we see, of being affected by the things that we see. And if you don't believe me, why in the world would a company pay $7 million for 30 seconds of your attention? $7 million for 30 seconds of your attention so that they can sell you something. And this does work. I'm thinking of, okay, all of us say, oh, commercials don't really affect me. They just go by, I mute them if I can or whatever, and they're going by, but they're not really a thing. I think they actually do. It must work, or people wouldn't put this much money into them. And I know when I was a teenager, let me say this, you should know this about me, and it might help explain why I'm so fascinated by this topic. But growing up, we didn't have a television in our home. My dad said, we're going to live real life. Yeah, that's what he always told us. We'd say, Dad, could we get a TV? Mom, please, could we get a TV? My dad would always say, nope, we're not going to get TV. We're going to live real life. And we did, too. And I had a great childhood, and we had tons of fun adventures as a family. However, at age 16, for me, and I'm the oldest of 3 girls in the family, at age 16, a doctor family friend of ours said, we'd like to give you our old TV cabinet. Now, this cabinet matched my parents' furniture that they bought when they got married. It was called Brasilia. It was a very mid-century sort of design. They still have it, and they're in their 80s, okay? They love that furniture. Well, this doctor family we knew in Yakima had one piece out of everything they owned was this Brasilia, and it was this large entertainment cabinet with a TV in the middle and a stereo on one side and storage on the other. And when they upgraded their furniture, when I was 16, they gave the TV to, really it was the cabinet they were giving, to our family. And they said, the TV doesn't really work very well anymore, but we thought you guys might like to have this cabinet that matches your furniture. So they arrived the TV when I was 16. And this TV didn't work very well, all right. The green tube was pretty much the only one that worked. The others were this was a tube TV. The The other ones weren't that great. But if you slap the thing underneath it real hard a few times, you could sometimes make those other tubes connect, and you could have a full picture. Well, let me tell you, at age 16, I found out why we didn't have a TV in our family. It was my dad who was the TV addict. And the TV was on every night from supper till bed. Supper till bed. And we would usually eat supper together around the table. I will still give credit for that. But then, it was on, and we saw lots of stuff. Well, hey, I got commercials for the first time. We were also a family that didn't drink caffeinated soda. Okay? So my whole life we had been drinking A&W root beer and 7-Up when we needed to have a treat. And my parents loved Dr. Pepper, but when it put caffeine in, when I was probably about 6 years old, that was the end of Dr. Pepper in our house. So there we were, caffeine-free, but those commercials that came on? There were these great commercials in the 80s for Coke. Coca-Cola, and they had some of the best singers in the world and actors and stuff. Coke is it said. Coke is it, exclamation point. And that was the theme. And suddenly, I had never needed to taste Coca-Cola in my life before. I never even cared. And now, all I could think about was how I was going to taste some Coca-Cola. Really, really, really wanted to try that stuff, but I was a principled girl, very principled, and I was not having that caffeine. Nope, none of it. But Coke came out with their caffeine-free Coke, not too far into that. So I got to try it, and then I said, I don't know what that was all about, because Coke tastes terrible. And I still think it's not that great. Okay, so commercials do affect us. I think they do, even if we think they don't, and we don't want them to. There is more than one kind of effect that happens. There are manifested effects and there are process effects. What is the difference between those? Well, a manifested effect is that thing that we obviously see. Like, I went out and bought some Coca-Cola. That is a manifested effect. But process effects are things that are happening underneath that are changing the way we think about things, but might not be so obvious yet. And we have Dr. James Potter, who describes this really well in his book on media literacy. He actually writes textbooks on media literacy and is one of the leading thinkers on this topic. Here's what he has to say. There are media effects that we can easily observe. These are the manifested effects. But there are also other things going on in our minds due to media influence. The media are constantly in the process of influencing how we think, feel, and act, whether we manifest these things or not. Let's call these other effects process effects because we are always in a process of being influenced by mass media messages. If we focus our attention on only the manifested effects, the ones we can see in our behaviors, we will greatly underestimate the degree of influence the media exert on us. We need to consider process effects also. Just because we do not see an outward manifestation of these things does not mean that the media are without influence. And I think that's important for us to remember as we sometimes say to ourselves, when we make choices about certain things, we're talking about content now, okay? We make choices about certain things that we watch, and we might go, I don't believe that, and I know that isn't right. And so we're like, it's okay, because I don't live my life that way. I don't say those kind of words. I don't make that kind of choice, so it's okay. Let's look a little more at these 5 types of media effects then that Potter would describe. The cognitive type effect. Cognitive, that's with our thinking. Media can affect what we know by planting ideas and information into our minds, and this is the most prevalent media effect. In fact, you may have heard the expression, this comes from some communication theory, the news doesn't tell us what to think, but it tells us what to think about. I'm giving you a second to think about that. It might not tell us what to think, although sometimes it does. We have a lot of influenced media these days in one direction or another politically. It might try to tell us what to think, but for sure it tells us what to think about. So somebody's already filtering, somebody's already a gatekeeper, somebody's already processing. What stuff should you know about? What stuff should you be interested in? Attitudinal type effect. The media can create and shape our opinions, our beliefs, and our values. All of those things can certainly be shaped. Our emotional type effect, the media can make us feel things. They can trigger strong emotions, such as fear, rage, lust. Have you ever been watching a movie and cried? Emotional stuff. Physiological, let's get into this a little bit more. They can influence our automatic bodily systems, and these are usually beyond our conscious control, and there's where that thing comes. Suddenly you find yourself crying, or you find the hair on the back of your neck standing up, or goosebumps. I just had somebody tell me this morning at breakfast. I actually, when I went to breakfast at the hotel, I was wearing my The Chosen t-shirt. And there was another man there, and he said, I love your shirt. I love that show. Do you remember the scene where Jesus calls Mary by name? Of course I remembered. And he said, I got goosebumps. This is a stranger to me, says this to me this morning. He's telling me about his physiological type effect that he had from a media that we shared an interest in, that he could tell by the shirt I was wearing. And behavioral type effect, media can trigger actions. It can. We can actually do things differently. That's what every advertiser in the world is counting on. Everyone. They are counting on that they will take us through all of those steps and into actually, I'm so far behind on my notes over here. I have to flip a few pages. All right, so the brain. We've talked a little bit about how the brain is affected. That article we were reading together talked about the frontal lobe. This is the place where we are making our very important decisions. This is a super important part of our brain that we need to be very active. We need it to be. How can we live a Christian life? How can we follow God? How can we do His will? How can we even know and understand His will if this part of our brain isn't working well? And then we can look at the limbic system, which is found there, very central, and you can see it in the picture, inside the brain. That's where our emotions come from, our passions, our hungers. And we're talking about hungers, everything from food to sexual and all kinds of passions in between. Those are all happening in that part of the brain. By the way, this is not an unimportant part of the brain or something we should be afraid of or shut ourselves off from in some way. God gave us passionate natures. We're supposed to be passionate people about a lot of things. It's just that this part of the brain is supposed to be the filter through which the passions run. So I'm passionate about God's kingdom. Passionate about, I'm kind of a foodie, so food. So we're passionate about the things that we are. But we also have the ability here to process those emotional feelings, those passions, through this thinking part of the brain that makes decisions, that thinks about what's moral, that filters it through our values. And those are supposed to be working together. But if we're numbing this part of our brain here and causing it to atrophy, how are we going to make good decisions? We're just going to act on whatever we're passionate about then. And then if we look around and we say, why are people acting so much more like animals than they used to? This one is one of the most surprising things that I've found in studies on this topic. Media and aggression. A study by the Indiana University School of Medicine examined young men and violent media exposure. There were visible alterations in MRI brain scans after only 1 week of playing a violent video game. In particular, there was a significant decrease in the activation of the prefrontal portions of the brain and a greater activation of the amygdala. And you can see it in the pictures there. You can actually see the difference in the brain. This was such a startling study and such an important study because for the first time, what people were suspecting actually got looked at with an MRI in a way that we could actually see it and say, is there some connection between the violence that we are sometimes seeing around us, school shootings and that sort of thing, and what's happening for entertainment? That study that was quoting Dale Archer, and here's a little bit more from him. Dale Archer, MD, he's a psychiatrist, also an author. Globally, the video game industry brought in, and I'm sorry that the statistic is a little bit old, but I'm not dropping this out of my presentation. I started giving presentations like this in probably 2016 or so, and almost everything here is updated, but I don't want to let go of this one because he says what we need to hear, even if his statistic from 2012 is a little old. So in 66 billion in 2012, and 85% of these games contain some violence. I don't know what that statistic is right now. I'd like to know. Hopefully somebody's going to give an updated something for me soon. Of course, money is often the ultimate incentive to maintain the status quo. Brain changes, aggressive behavior, poor decision-making. As evidence continues to mount, the whole process is reminiscent of when cigarette smoking first became linked to cancer, emphysema, and lung disease. Just about everyone sensed it was true, but big money tobacco companies kept funding study after study that claimed that there was just no proof. 50 years from now, we'll all look back and wonder why it took so long. The evidence was just so overwhelming. And we are starting to get, I already read to you something, we're starting to get some evidence, even since he wrote this, that hopefully is helping people's minds to change a bit, and not letting those studies funded by the companies who are creating the games have quite so much power. I actually brought this book into church, but I left it down there because I didn't think the lip on here was quite enough to hold that book here while I was talking with you. But this is Adam Alter, and he's kind of a young guy, but he must be pretty smart because he's a social psychologist and professor at New York University. And he wrote a really, really great book that I recommend to you called Irresistible. And it has to do with what's going on with Google doesn't fare too well in his book, let's just say that. But looking at what's going on with trying to keep us on our devices. Alter says that technology is designed to be addictive, and that the gratification it provides is similar to that of other addictive behaviors. We already heard this, right? Such as drug abuse or gambling. Quote, if I'm addicted to, say, World of Warcraft, the minute I start firing up the game, my brain will look in a scan very much like the brain of someone who's addicted to heroin and is preparing for the next hit, he says. So now there's another person saying something really similar. During the act of playing the game, my brain will look very much like that person's brain will look as they're taking heroin, or the brain of someone who's addicted to gambling, as they sit in front of a slot machine and play the game. So what the brain looks like in these various activities. Social media and the brain a little bit more. Psychological addiction. Brain scans show similar impairment to that, as we already looked at, drug dependency. It's a clear degradation, we're hearing this again, clear degradation in the white matter in the frontal lobes. That's where we keep our attention on things, where we can focus, and where we make decisions. Really, really important part of our brain. Also, multitasking is decreased, a decrease in the ability to multitask effectively. Now, there are some who would say that we can't really multitask anyway, so it kind of depends on your definition of multitasking, but a decrease in that ability. And here's an interesting one, dopamine. The feel-good chemical levels go up when we are talking about ourselves on social media. Imagine that. It's a little dopamine hit to talk about ourselves. And interestingly, 30 to 40% of the conversation is about me in a face-to-face interaction. 30 to 40%. So if I'm talking with other people, it's pretty likely that a good portion of the conversation is also going to be about them. And if you walk away from a conversation and you realize, wow, I didn't learn very much about that other person, and I sure talked a lot about me, which, by the way, happens to me sometimes, okay? I confess, it's a fault. You should say to yourself, something went wrong there in that conversation. Why wasn't I more curious about that person? Why didn't I learn more about them? And why did I need to spend so much time talking about me or hearing myself talk, right? So in those face-to-face conversations, we tend to share back and forth about each other much more, whereas online, 80% of the conversation is about me. And not just the me, but the me I want you to see. The me that I'm portraying. And so we're looking at a lot of sort of false me's when we look on social media at other people's lives and what they're doing and who they are and how they look and where they've been, and all of those things are inflated, altered to make it look better, sound better than maybe however I'm living. And we know that that has led to a lot of depression for people. Very directly connected. I feel like we need a little inspiration right about now. I've just been telling you a bunch of bad news. So let's look at this, Romans 12:2. And, okay, let's put it in this context. So the world is like this, okay? It is. Do not be conformed to this world. We don't have to be. But be transformed by the renewing of your mind so that you may prove what the will of God is, and that which is good and acceptable and even perfect. Do not be conformed, but be transformed. If there's a great theme text for, we've already read it, the scripture reading was a great theme text too for what we're talking about today, but this is a great theme text for what we're talking about. So the world is like this. So the mediated world has a lot of dangers in it, a lot of things to be nervous about that could frighten us really easily. We don't have to be conformed to the world around us. We're called to something else. We can be transformed. How? Instead of letting our minds go this way, by the renewing of our minds. And this afternoon, I am going to be talking about some very specific things that we can do. So we're going to talk about some biblical principles this afternoon that we can hold on to, and then some things that we can do to change the way we are living with our media environment if we're not happy with how it's going for us or for our families. Maybe we're not 100% happy. I'm not 100% happy with how it goes right now. It's probably a good place to be, not totally satisfied, with how it is. But in the process of being transformed by the renewing of our minds. And now also a little good and bad news, both. It depends on how you look at it. Actually, I look at this as really good news. I'm the director for the Center for Media Ministry at Walla Walla University. And so we're looking at the good side of this. Bandura's social learning theory. When I first heard this theory as a master's student back in the mid-2000s, I got so excited. I was so happy. Like, this actually works. There's a good theory here. Individuals learn not only in classrooms, but also by observing role models in everyday life. Okay, we know that. Kids do what their parents do, at least for a while, till they decide not to. Our kids, he told you they're 17, and 19. They're at the decide not to stage. They're actually making really good choices overall. Really, we're so happy that they're making good choices. But they're definitely at that phase of, I got to be my own person, as is healthy and as they should. Everyone has to be their own person, make their own decisions, make their own connection with God, and all of those things. But we learn from the role models in our everyday life, our parents, our teachers, thank you teachers who are up here, and the other influential Pathfinder leaders, all the other influential people that are in our lives, we learn from them, but we also learn from role models we might not be intending, like characters in movies and on television. And the interesting thing that Bandura found in his very scientific sort of studies, looking at people and studying them and conducting experiments with people, he learned that those role models that we see visually in television shows and movies are almost as influential as the people in real life. And we already heard the Clark Gable undershirt story, right? So it's amazing how influential that is and how we might model ourselves after people that we feel like we know because we've seen them in close-up on the screen. That's a whole nother study. And I love close-up when I'm watching media because then I feel like, I really can understand this person and I really know who they are. But if you think about it, the only people that you get that close to in real life, boyfriend, girlfriend, spouse, children, mom and dad, your own mom and dad. That's it. We never get into close-up with anybody else in life, but yet we see these people on the screen, sometimes big screen, that close. The brain doesn't know the difference. And suddenly you feel very intimately connected to that person. I'm sidetracking myself, but it's a whole nother interesting study. So no wonder those people have an effect on us. No wonder they feel like role models to us. We have been in intimate proximity to them through those close-ups. All right, I throw this in just to show that there is kind of a process. This is also what advertisers are counting on. There's a hierarchy of media effects that it works in a certain order, and certainly the person who is trying to sell you something wants to get you across this whole process. So first the message is presented to you, you get the message, then there's some attention to it. If it doesn't keep your attention or hold your attention, then there's no use going on from there. So in anything that we're creating in visual media, you got to hold attention. And then there's some comprehension of that idea, and then you decide to agree with the message, or you might argue against it, but if you decide to agree with it, then you're going to move up to retaining it. That's the next goal, and then finally you do something about it. You actually act on it. Again, what every advertiser is hoping for. It's also what any of us who are trying to do something good with media are counting on, and what we're hoping for. There's a whole field of study called entertainment education, and by the way, it really works. I mean, there's a whole, I can't tell you about all these studies, but there was one in Africa where there was just a whole area, I believe it was in Kenya, where people were dying from HIV. And they just wanted these people to be able to learn to protect themselves. And this wasn't some noble Christian endeavor. They were just trying to get these people to use condoms and things like that, protect themselves so they didn't have to die. And so nothing was working. Lectures they were giving and pamphlets they were handing out and things that doctors were saying, nothing was working. And so for one of these initiatives, they created a film, a movie, a narrative story about a guy in Kenya who gets HIV and what he does about it, and then what he learns and what his friends do differently. And it was all woven into this narrative that was very engaging. They played the film all over the country. And then they measured what the change in people's behavior and what they did differently. And it worked. It worked. The numbers way down, people protecting themselves way up. And so we know that this works, this process works. This is really good news for anybody who'd like to share about God's kingdom. This works. Put it into a narrative. Put it into a story. Tell people, show them, use the close-ups, use the stories that will help them to understand the principles of God's kingdom. So while we can hear a lot of negatives about it, I really love to look at these theories, Bandura's theory and McGuire's six-step model. I like to think of those things in a very positive way. We can do something awesome and amazing to influence for God's kingdom, and it is being done. There are people who are doing it. Not everything's perfect. Not everything 100% might fall into line with what, I know not everyone in the room, but probably a lot of people in the room are Seventh-day Adventist or come from a Seventh-day Adventist background. And maybe not everything in some of these pictures I have on the screen falls right in line with exactly what we believe on every point, but certainly the media leaders who have created, they're creatives, they're filmmakers who have created these three and many other examples that I could have on the screen. They're trying to do that. They're trying to influence society where society is on our screens with something that can move them and influence them towards God's kingdom. And it works. And here's some of the reasons why. Many films transmit ideas through emotion rather than intellect. They can neutralize the instinct to suppress feelings and trigger emotional release, said Bridget Woltz, a psychologist focusing on movies as therapy, and the author of Emotion, Picture Magic. By eliciting emotions, watching movies can open doors that otherwise might stay closed. And I hope you're looking at this thing in a plus and minus kind of way, because it's emotional versus rational processing. So right there, you know that these things are going more into the central part of the brain, into the amygdala, than they are, okay? There's the possibility for that. This person who's writing about it is saying that can help us with therapy with people who haven't been able to access those emotions. And the next one on the screen is that I want to show you. She's also saying that. And I may not read the whole thing here, but she's also saying we can use these things to help people access those emotions. So that has a plus and a minus, right? It means that we can use these things effectively to draw people in for good, but it also means we need to be really, really aware, media literacy, really aware as consumers, that when we watch stuff like that, whatever the values are that are embedded in that story, and believe me, every single movie, every show, every YouTube video, everything has a content message. It does, whether the person who created it intended it or didn't. Their values, their message is going to come out into what they're creating. So we just need to be aware that that's there. So that helps us to think, okay, let's have some perspicacity. Let's be discerning about what we might expose ourselves to. If those values, if that content message isn't in agreement with my core values, then I really ought to be super, super careful, because when I'm watching it, I'm turning down the logical, the discerning thinking, and I'm turning up the emotional thinking. So if it is in agreement, then I guess you're a little safer, right? Because then at least you're looking at something, you're feeling emotional, and again, emotions and passions aren't a bad thing, but at least you know that you're with content that agrees with your values and where you're at. A little more inspiration, Psalm 119:37. Turn away my eyes from looking at vanity and revive me in your ways. I think we can really, really apply this to the visual media that we see. Vanity. Some of it's just not worth it. It's just candy. Some of it's cotton candy. I think that's a good metaphor, actually, because you know how cotton candy is. It's just sugar, but it's all spun up to look like something really big and awesome. When you put it in your mouth, it just goes, yeah. So some of it's just cotton candy. Turn my eyes away from looking at vanity and revive me in your ways. So just thinking carefully about these things, having some discernment, having some perspicacity. And this isn't like discernment and perspicacity that we're just going to generate out of our own hearts and minds. This is something we have to pray about, that we have to be in connection with God. We got to be putting some good food in. Bible reading, Bible study, digging deeper, thinking about God's kingdom, reading things that will help us to understand that, watching things that will help us to understand God's kingdom. Those are the things that will feed our souls toward His ways, toward His kingdom. Okay, there is going to be more this afternoon, but for right now, let's close with prayer. Father in heaven, as we have been talking together this morning and sharing these things, you know that it can feel overwhelming. It can feel frightening, because there is so much around us that isn't going in the direction of your kingdom. And yet we know that you are alive and active and working, and there are also places where we can find you in the media and in lots of other places, in nature and in our Bibles and interactions with people who love you. We pray that you'll help us to make good choices, that we will focus our attention on your kingdom, that we won't let go of you. We know you're not letting go of us, and that you will give us the courage and the strength that we need to make some changes that we might need to make in order to make the path clear for moving toward you. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, remember to join us for the fellowship meal, and then also this afternoon at 2 o'clock right here.